want to pick up on the last point, but we'll get to your question, takers, in a few minutes. Yes, please. Thank you. Unless you want to stand for 20 minutes. Yes. I want to come back to the emotion in games question. Is it a question of emotion in games or emotion around games?
Yeah. Wow. I was just actually thinking that. You're right. That's very that exact phrasing. So yeah, I don't know. It's I guess yeah. I'm thinking a lot more about emotion sort of around games than that emotion is being baked into a game.
Right. When we say emotion in games, you mean games as representational vehicles that have characters or situations within them that represent something? Like, is that what you mean by emotion in games?
That's one way to look at it.
Right, because it's like what emotion is in poker in that sense, right? But it's plain as day that there's the panoply of human emotions happening when one experiences and plays games.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the question of emotion within the content of the game versus the emotion that emerges out of the experience of game versus the emotion that happens outside the game.
So I don't believe there's an emotion in a game at all, right? I mean, at my house there's a BMW sitting. There is no motion in that car. When you add the player to it, now we've got the motion. And it's the same thing. There's emotion that happens when the game is just a set of rules. That's it. That's all the game ever is, right? And once you add the player and it starts moving, that's when the emotion happens.
But is there emotion in a film?
No, because if it's sitting on the shelf, there's no emotion. That is a film. Is there emotion in that iPhone? No.
Right. So they're all just waiting there. They're waiting there for somebody to...
It requires a participant.
Well, I mean, I think your experience with the path is very, it's a good kind of talking point with this, right? You said some people just look at it and it's just, there's nothing there for them, right? And then Brenda has this deep response.
Well, that was sort of the whole issue with the path was some people would play it one way and other people play another. And there would be these discussions that would go on our forums or whatever. And people would be like, "Did you even play the same game that I played?" Like,
exactly.
you know, and that was, but that's how we see video games in general. And when we say that games are tools or something like that, it's just that we set up the situation and yeah, a lot went into it. I mean, a lot of the my own personal experiences are the ways that we thought, things that we thought of when we sat there talking about these girls, etc. But we weren't trying to make a movie out of it, where it's like, oh, this is this is what happened to her. This is what happened, it's all like laid out for you. It was indeed something we wanted people to experience in different ways. We think that that's like something that can happen with games, that people experience these things in different ways. I'm talking about now single-player video games, of course, but
right.
But I think that that's something that's like hasn't been explored much, in terms of, or that specific aspect of a video game. It's usually about action or something of that nature. It's like, so we wanted something that was more, about all these intangible things that.
What's the expectations people bring to the experience, right?
Yeah.
Brenda went into that open to certain things that some of the people who were trolling your forums might not have been. I can think of my experience in showing Jason's game Passage to some of my students who typically played AAA title games, and they really didn't have a clear point of entry to that experience, and to allow themselves to have the kind of emotional response.
Can I ask Nathalie a question about emotion in architecture? So I mean, sometimes architects talk about creating spaces that are meant to create a feeling. I guess, obviously Brenda's games are meant to evoke emotion, right? Meant to make people feel things, even if there's no... I mean, your intention behind them is to make people feel something, right? No.
I want to see if I can explore a difficult topic.
Right.
What happens out of that?
Well, no, but even during your talk, you said Brenda Brathwaite makes
I
people
think that's a problem
cry.
that I have often when I hear game designers talk about this. They think about these things as engineers, and they're going to design these emotions, but that's absurd. I mean, it's the people who have the emotion. All you do is design an environment where people can have emotions, and which emotions they're going to have depends on these people, much more than on your game.
Yes, I'm still interested in hearing the architecture.
I think that the analogy with architecture and game is working. The analogy in architecture and game and structure is, to me, surprisingly similar, because it's by creating some limit that you allow possible opportunity of experience if you didn't set some sort of limit, that could be the wall or entrance or whatever you do, there will be an experience at all. Will be blank. At the same time, you have no control. You can determine the life which is going to happen there. In a way, you express your sensibility in the way that you define the rule and what you're focusing in. But what you're hoping for is what's going to happen next. It's not just an object. Or there is a part which is enjoying the pureness of the object, per se, but that's really sterile.
Right. I think another book for people to look at, Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn, is a really interesting exploration of how architects' intentions transform over time and through use. There's a great, on the cover of the book, is a pair of homes in New Orleans, a picture of them when they were originally built and then a picture 100 years later. And one of them is pretty close to what it was before and the other one is completely transformed, completely unrecognizable.
But buildings do have an impact. I was in San Francisco some time ago and visited both the Museum of Art from Mario Botta, and it's a very rigid plant, and then Museum for Art Zimmerman, the Jung Museum maybe. But anyway, in one of the museums I felt like everything could be categorized. Like when you, it was very surprising to me arriving in the state that you would have to check your race, and you could classify it. And in that building is expressing the same thing. Everything is so imposing and rigid that it's like everything has a category which is classified. And the architecture of the more contemporary museum was really scary because everything was out of order. There were no straight lines. Would I be able to do something like that? But at the same time, it was such a more free expression, and people were sitting on the stairs instead of having to stay straight. And I think that, for me, all of you are setting a sort of different way to frame what life is about, which to me are kind of all interesting. They are all interesting. I don't see that the debate is so strong as it currently is. It's just you're framing it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Natalie's the diplomat, I guess. But I think, but I think you just said it. I think interestingly in your comment just now, which is that the players, matter so much more than the structures or spaces which are given. And maybe it's a question of emphasis and sensibility, and it varies from project to project, player to player, context to context. But it's kind of like arguing who brings more to a piece of music, the composer or the musician, or is it about the audience? And I think those are all useful points of view. It's useful to talk about composition and the beauty of a composition before a music is played. But obviously it gains most of its meaning in culture through its play and the reception of play. And I think about Frank's talk in that golf swing, right? And the idea that like hitting a single ball of golf is like a diagram for a set of possibilities, just a moment in time, and there's a billion ways that ball could travel through space. And in a certain sense, as game designers, we have that problem sort of squared, right? We're creating spaces of possibility in which those angles of probability play out. And I think it's a very interesting, complicated problem with intellectual qualities, mathematical qualities, emotional qualities, cultural qualities. So there's so many interesting ways to frame that problem, things to emphasize. But it's not, I don't think it's something that can be contained. It's like arguing about the shape of the universe or something. It's like a really interesting theoretical problem. It means different things in Hindu mythology than it does in like string theory.
I want to do one correction, and then I want to talk about architecture in games. So I never said that my games made people cry. Somebody told me that.
Right.
And my games, most recently, I was told by a group of people who did a playtest of Train, I have no idea how they did this, that, quote, I should be punched in the face by a group of them.
You make games that make people angry.
Yes, apparently I do. But so when it comes to architecture, I had mentioning E2M5 from Quake, that I mentioned that in talking about architecture, I feel like everything in that level, the reason that I sort of honed in on that, because everything in that level was very specific. It just wasn't like, oh, let's just put a wall there because it fits. everything was designed to make me feel a certain way. There's this ride in this level, which I'll ruin for everybody who hasn't played it now, where you go through and you get this just enough health, and you go through the ride, and like the designer is literally drowning you the whole way through, and like you're getting to the point like, oh my God, this has got to end, this has got to end, you're choking, right. And then you're like, holy shit, this wouldn't be anything. You've done something wrong, and then literally at the last possible second, you know, it's like, there you are, you get this help. Again, you're all right, but like, what an amazing way to use architecture to evoke fear. I'm not suggesting we should do this in the actual real life buildings.
That's our next project.
This is certainly not something alien to games. You know, the best designed levels are designed to evoke a specific feeling.
Aurea mentioned this in their talk, and you brought it up just a second ago again, that games as tools. And I think Eric was starting to sort of explore that, but I would love to hear what the others of you think of that phrase and then the sort of ideas behind it.
The others meaning other than Eric? Or?
No, other than Aurea.
Well,
Yeah, she brought the idea up, so I'd just like to hear what you all think.
I mean, I'll say quickly that when I was originally trained as a painter, and you know, really, although I guess I started making games when I was very, very little, so I sort of returned to that, or never stopped doing it, you could say. But when I was being trained as a painter, you know, I was sort of obsessed with these relationships between the viewer and the art and the artwork, and how you enter into the picture plane and what flatness versus depth, and also all those issues that come to the fore when you're making images through pigment on a flat surface. And you know, it's funny because classically, and again, in a classical, conventional, let's say pre-20th century sense, the work of art is a beautiful object that's there for contemplation. You know, and in shifting my artistic practice from that to other modes of game design and contemporary art practice at the time when I was a student, it was such a revelation that it's kind of like, rather than me theorizing about these relationships between the work and the viewer, the artist, and the space they're entering in, I literally, to me, it was like I was making a toolbox, and the viewer, or participant, or player creates an experience for themselves, you know, and is much more empowered to do so. And to me, that was just a much more exciting idea and an interesting idea. And in some ways, it's kind of what every artist dreams about, sort of secretly, and this is just from my experience in art school, that they want the gallery as this meditative space where people will go in and have an intense emotional experience with their work, or they want it as a place that's going to deconstruct aspects of culture and leave people intellectually spinning and new ideas. And in a certain sense of being as game designers, we have this sort of delicious set of meals composed entirely out of dessert. Like we kind of get to see our players doing stuff with the things that we make, which I think other producers of culture, like maybe wouldn't every composer in a sense love for all of their audience members to be musicians, right? We have that. I mean, yes, there are spectators in sports and other games, but primarily we design for players. And I think it's a wonderful luxury, and it's very much like designing for tools.
Yeah, I mean, I guess partially through my own obsession with German board game design in recent years, I've sort of been thinking a lot about games more and more along these lines, about these things that, I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is that it's not just sort of this completely open-ended toolbox. I mean, one of the things that we really like about like a German board game is that it has this structure to it, and we approach it and we learn it together, like me and my wife, or me and my wife and my friends. We read the rules and we come to understand it. We come to, like, in this manifesto that I passed out, I talk about learning a new game is less like listening to a new song and more like learning a new language, right? So the fact that there's this thing to learn about and this thing to come to understand is an important part of it. It's not just sort of this open-ended. I guess I'd say it's very different from a box of Legos because it has so much stuff that was sort of intentionally put there too that sort of modulates. So yeah, it's like this interface, but it's a very constructed interface that we come up to and we use as a mode of communication from mind to mind. It is a tool, but it's a tool with like a very, very, very specific purpose that, you know, yes, we play with and we mod and we, you know, but there's like go and play 16 tons. You're either playing it or you're not. I mean, if you completely get to the point where you're just moving things willy-nilly on the board, not taking turns anymore and whatever, you've sort of gone outside of the game, right? So, And there's little mods that have happened, and those are sort of allowable mods, but they're within the space of what's allowed, right? Like playing with $5 bills, saying we'll split the winnings with the winner if you help me win, or with a loser who will help you win, and those types of things. Still feel like it's still 16 tons, but if you got to the point where you were walking the metal objects around the gallery and hiding them in corners, you know, or something like that, then it's like something about the structure is very important. So it's like this often toolbox, and that's something that's really interesting to me.
To me, so I don't, C feels like a tool to me, and these are tools. This is what made my game. And eventually when I stop doing segmentation faults and understand pointers, I will do something with C. But those feel like tools, the games don't. And maybe that's just my current perspective.
So manifestos in games. Yes.
So when Brenda seemed to be really angry at me about this manifesto. Can I quote you, Brenda?
Go ahead.
She said, "This is retarded." And she also said something that I thought was really interesting. She said, like, "You're not. How old are you? You're not even old enough to
I
like."
didn't say that.
You said something about how old or how experienced it was. I'm not experienced enough to have written this. But I guess I feel like if you look back in the history of manifestos, a lot of them are written by young people, right? It's sort of right. Like if you read the Futurist Manifesto, it sounds like something right out of Fight Club, right? Like these young men, they were talking about almost getting in a car accident on purpose and feeling life pulsing through their veins, right? And how the machines are going to transform, and you know. So yeah, I guess I feel like, you know, manifestos can be this provocation from the young to the more experienced, and sort of like just kind of coming up with something kind of, you know, crazy and trying to drop a bomb, kind of, right?
Yeah.
Manifesto, but yeah, indeed, it's sort of something you make out of your idealism, right?
Right.
Before you get jaded, that's the only time you really want to make manifesto. Because you see things that you can't quite accomplish just yet, and you want to tell people about these things, but you want to tell them in such a way that they get really pissed off at you and write your hate mail. And but then other people it activates, and you know, or it starts another kind of conversation. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I'm really happy that Jason wrote his manifesto actually, because it's sort of it's something that will keep the conversation going. I think in new and interesting, unfold ways. How much I agree with it this year. But yeah.
But why not make it a game?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to do a
why on
manifesto.
paper? Why on paper, not a game?
No, I mean, I think we can successfully argue that Train is a manifesto. I was determined to prove the games didn't have to be commercial, you didn't have to make a million of them, they didn't have to be digital. They didn't have to be about half the subjects. They didn't have to be about a great many things.
Right.
In fact, you didn't even know the ending of the game.
Well, Brenda, why didn't you give a talk? Why didn't you make a game?
How do you know this isn't one?
I'm saying, like, I mean, there are these traditional forms. I was just sort of like piggybacking onto the idea of coming to this conference. I mean, the idea of the manifesto sort of came up in connection with, you know, I was pushed forward by the idea of this like conference. I had this inkling of a manifesto in my head, and when this conference came up, I was like, oh, that'll be a place where this kind of fits in, right? You know, where people are going to be talking about the history of art, and we're talking about art movements and the art movements in games, and sort of this almost like anachronistic kind of thing, this manifesto on paper, right? I mean, it's just, you know, it sort of felt like, you know, I've never handed out a manifesto on paper before.
I think I tried to write a manifesto and turned it into rules of play. Like 800 pages, Katie Salen. So
Did you ever try to drop it out of an airplane?
I killed people. That book is dangerous.
I think I've got it.
Yeah. Not necessarily. I mean, one of the things you all just said about manifestos is, you know, it's perhaps an expression of some frustration of things that can't be done yet. And I think that ties in nicely with what Jason was talking about with Checker and those folks with the we can't do this yet. It's not quite there yet. And
It's already been done. The things that Checker said couldn't be done have been done.
well, is it real? Is it an excuse? Is it what is it?
It's frustration, right? These are opportunities. You know, many of the
Just to
great
clarify, Checker is Chris Hecker.
games- Oh, sorry. But many of these things that are frustrations, I view as opportunities. You know, we are blessed to live in an age where like somebody's creative sports, right? You know, or maybe somebody's going to do that. But I view these things as opportunities, and I think a lot of these things work in them. And I'm going to shut up because I'm doing it better.
Eric, what's your thought on that view?
Oh, I have designed sports.
Oh, there we are.
And wish to become Olympic Games.
I should clarify, I'm not actually a bad mood, that was emotional.
Yeah.
So you're getting me, yes, I'm Irish.
The aftershock. Aftershock of your emotion. It just feels like a very kind of modern, mechanical age, digital age sort of problem, that we've got these tools now that we feel like we haven't pushed far enough along to do all the things that we possibly imagine. And it's interesting to me.
I mean, Jason, I appreciate your talk, and I think that you know, the way I framed that same sort of problem in years past is that for me it's a kind of combination of cinema envy and immersive fallacy, right? I mean, those are the cinema envy being that games are trying to ape the pleasures of other media, and barking up the tree of cinema is one of them. And the immersive fallacy, the idea that the pleasure of a media experience is its ability to transport you into an illusionistic world in which the real world falls away and you somehow in some part of your mind or all of your mind believe that you're actually in that other place, which I think that the first one is a kind of interesting and common thing that happens in history, but the second one is a kind of I think, an antiquated idea about how media, art, entertainment experience functions. And it's been, again, at least 100 years since you know, people are feeling that way, that the grammar of cinema is really artificial, and it's interesting, and we've kind of become naturalized to it, just like we're naturalized to the language that I'm speaking right now, but it's an artificial language, and you know, you know, working with or against the grain, I think is an interesting point. I just think that on the other hand, I wouldn't want to stop people that want to try and create Hamlet on the holodeck, right? I mean, I think it's kind of silly for the reasons that I just articulated, but
Wouldn't you love it if it existed? You wouldn't want to try it if it existed?
I don't know.
You're saying, if I had a holodeck in my backpack and I brought it out in the back room.
I don't know. I mean,
She's really cute.
I mean, if I could fart money, I'd want to spend it too. I mean, in other words, what I'm not even concerned about a holodeck existing. What I'm saying is that I think that it's a potentially interesting and fruitful set of design problems to explore. And I think that what happens when you explore really hard design problems is often unexpected things and interesting things, right? And so who's to say that the solutions aren't there? I mean, I think that games can tell stories, and I'm always interested in the stories that only a game could play, could tell, right, or play. And I think that the work that Brenda presented, Taylor presented, exploring some of those issues. But you know, sometimes when you set out to climb a mountain, you might discover an ocean. You know, and who's to say that it's not great to swim in that ocean, but you thought you were going to go rock climbing.
Right. So I think we should open it up to questions. Celia, you were at the mic, so come on up.
First of all, I want to say.
Go ahead.
Thank you guys for a really great morning. I really enjoyed the whole symposium, but I think this was my favorite part, at least so far. And I wanted to ask a question specifically about narrative, because 3 of you made games that had some kind of narrative to them. But if you compare Brenda's game, Jason's game, and the Telltale's games, you can see a wide range of approaches to abstraction and translating narrative into a mechanic in combination with the representations of the narrative. So for instance, Brenda's characters, if you think about them compared to Jason's characters, compared to your guys' characters. And I just think it would be interesting to hear a little bit, because you've all done something really compelling and unique and original with creating story-driven games, but using radically different design approaches. So I'd really like to hear you guys talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, I guess I don't know if you would call Passage, a story-driven game. I guess that, during my talk I mentioned that some people talked about the stories that they've been able to tell sort of through Passage. These characters are these sort of empty vessels, right? I mean, there's just this little. I mean, he's 8 by 8 pixels, right? This is enough pixels to recognize that he's a little guy, and there's like 2 extra pixels on the girl, just using the stereotype of longer hair and she's wearing a dress, right? Which my wife doesn't even necessarily have. But just enough to recognize that she's different than you. I mean, that's all the fidelity that's there. So that really turns them into these empty vessels that you really step into. And people wrote me emails saying, like, I really, thought about the decisions I've made in my own life and my relationship to my loved one and so on. And so it really didn't have like the traditional trappings of narrative where I created characters and I had created situations and stories about those characters that I was telling to somebody. It was like this sort of, system where you could step in and tell a story about yourself, I guess, in a very abstract, symbolic kind of way. And of course, the thing I'm doing that I did now with Sleep is Death is sort of trying to sort of tackle that problem from a different angle, where like, can we actually have dialogue in a game that actually is interactive, and how are we going to do that? Well, here's this kind of really, I don't know, kind of almost a laughable response to that, right? Just take a person at the other side and let them type the dialogue back to you, right?
Mine, it was already a story in every one of my games, so I just was trying to find the system. I was just looking for the map of the story. So I don't,
I find it very difficult to talk about it because it's so very layered. Partially because we work with stories that already existed very often, and I have written existed for a very long time that have gone through lots of mutations. So part of the story in the game is a story about story. But when we make things, it usually is not because we want to tell a story. I think it's quite close to what Jason was saying. It's more about, but maybe a little bit more directed, like a little bit heavier, like putting things in there that we find important, but creating. Korea has called it a tool. You could also call it kind of like a test almost, like a scientific test. You set all these elements there, and then you just want to see what happens. And the results are different depending on which player is added as part of the elements in the test. And those elements are very important, and that's where we find authorship to be very, very essential, because the choice of those elements makes the experience more or less interesting.
I just want to say, Natalie, one of the things that made me want to work with you is that during one of our first conversations, I think you said to me that for you, architecture was a narrative medium.
Which is what Brenda was saying, that you can, just by different height and spaces, you create a narrative. And this is not defining a story, of course, but it's giving space to different moods and compressing or letting more space for others.
I think what we're all doing, like all of us up here, are trying to deal with narrative, but yes, in a different way, but definitely not in the same way that narrative is dealt with in a film or a book or a song or something like
Or a
that.
AAA video game.
Or a AAA video game, for that matter, everyone. And so that's the sort of interesting thing that's going on.
I'm not surprised that the thin reference is always the one on top, and maybe I have a jaded point of view. Do you say jaded? But I feel that architecture is much more
We've always felt
similarity.
We live 10 minutes away from the St. Bob's Cathedral in Ghent, and this is a major influence on our work. It's a Gothic cathedral.
I feel that the similarity in the design process, and if a game has rule, as Eric was thinking maybe more than you do, you can't break the structure completely. There's a need anyway for a system that works. Then you can break other part of the play, but the mechanics, I don't know, I just feel that architecture is a stronger metaphor than film, and that the comparison with filmography is sort of shifting from a better relationship with games and stuff.
If games were considered to be as much art as painting or any other media, A, how would that change the way the gaming world is, and B, how would it change game designers and the way they design games?
I mean, I think one thing to understand is that the category of art is just really complicated. And I said this a little bit in my talk. What category? I mean, in a certain sense, in my mind, the cultural juice is no longer in the category of art. I mean, to me, so something that's happened in the last couple of decades is that people are not looking for the art world as the vanguard of the most, again, use an avant-garde metaphor, the most interesting or innovative things happening in culture. Wherever that's happening, is happening a lot around design and technology, in my mind. Whatever you want to call it, smart mobs or social networks, that seems to, in general, for me to have more juice in the popular imagination, more interesting things going on. And it's part of why I ended up in games, is I felt that traditional art making categories weren't as I felt like I was reshuffling the cards of the deck that someone handed to me. So as opposed to like inventing new stuff and creating sense of possibilities, and so it's hard. I'm not sure that, do we want to aspire to games wanting to be art? So I would question the question.
No, wait. See, part of the reason why we put up that slide about 8 with all the things it didn't have in it, and part of the reason why we make what we make is when we first started working with games industry, etc., getting to know it better and trying to figure out how to make the games that we wanted to make, we realized that in your average World War II shooter game, there's not one person who stands up and says, okay, this was my idea, this is the game I wanted to make, here's what I think about the content of this game. I mean, this was a long time ago, and it's gotten a lot better now, a lot more about who the developers of games and what they're thinking sometimes, and sometimes it's idiotic, but sometimes that's interesting. But at the time, it was sort of like, there was this beginning of the sort of games are art, and we go to these conferences and they'd be like, oh yes, games are art, but it seemed like they were just saying games are art so they wouldn't get, so they had more like First Amendment rights or something, freedom of speech, and it wasn't really trying to think of like, well, what is the content of my game? What am I communicating to people? And to us, we were like, well, they're communicating all this stuff, to culture and society.
Yeah, the thing, I guess it relates to what I said before. The thing that struck us back then and still does now is that all these people are trying to make art, but none of them is an artist.
Well, yeah, it was like, well, and I don't mean that in the like elitist sense. I mean that in the sense of just that. I mean that in the sense of the thought process, I guess, or some sort of. I wanted to see some sort of care. It's like if you're gonna, or responsibility. I mean that in good and bad. It's like, and one of the things that excited me about talking to Brenda recently was that she has all this experience as a game developer. I mean, she's like one of the few. You're the first game developer I've ever met who has all these years of experience with traditional game design, with digital game design, with all this stuff, and then you stand up on stage and you talk about your process as an artist. I mean, and to me that's very important. To me that's the next level. To me that's like something that's like extremely interesting, and I'm not saying everyone should do that or whatever. I'm just saying that the fact that doesn't happen more often in the games industry is this sort of, I don't know, call it sincerity, call it not grabbing for money, call it, what you will, It's like, to me, this is what happens when games become art, is that you get sincerity, you get cultural artifacts that are relevant to people on all sorts of levels. And not just like, testosterone, not just, it's not just one narrow thing as games are commonly perceived. There's a lot of things going on underneath the surface, but it's like there's potential for it being a much more important field.
So I actually want to follow up on that about Brenda, because when I first met her, I was struck by, she was talking about these non-digital games she was making, and I recall her saying something like, we were in a group that was working on a project Horseshoe called the Game Designer as Artist. She was saying sort of like, for the first time in my career, I'm thinking about myself like an artist. I feel like an artist, and I'm interested to hear your perspective about why more people in the game industry don't think about themselves that way or don't feel that way when they're working on mainstream games, and why there was this sort of phase transition for you, if there was one. And
I think it was just, it took past where I wrote an extensive paper for an art criticism class in which I was told, and I quoted, "Games are not art," by the PhD who graded the paper. And I want you guys to all think for a minute, if I challenged you with creating a genre, just think about how fucking daunting that is. Think about creating a genre. Think about creating something that's never been done before. This is what I wrote my paper on. And I wrote it on the creation of Doom. And how amazing, you can look at something like Far Cry, or you can look at Halo, you can look at Modern Warfare. Just imagine having no first-person shooters to look back on. That shit's got to come out of your head. And that's genius. You, dude, are a genius for that stuff. And you deserve a tremendous round of applause for that. I recognize Doom as a work of art. And it's not my problem that museums don't yet, although the Smithsonian is putting on other things. So I think it's just a point in culture. People look at the graphic novel and go, wow, now. But, Pollock, they made fun of him a lot, too, We'll have our moments. I don't need to change. Art will function.
Just to clarify my position, I think that games should aspire to be more than they are, deeply meaningful take on important cultural issues. I think that game design or game making as a practice, as a deeply personal practice, is really important and something that we should investigate. It's just that for me, aspiring to the category of art, it's like, again, aspiring to those pioneer villages where people are dipping candles in wax. Maybe it's because I come from being an artist and I feel liberated in some ways of escaping from the art world.
I never thought of when you was art. Somebody else put that word on them. And trying to define art, to me, is more horrific a task than trying to define game, which we've never been successful at that. I don't see the art one coming along and being successful either.
One more question.
Hi. This question has been kind of forming and reforming itself in my head, and I'm trying to address the emotional underlying of the games with it, because in my experience, without emotion, there can be no experience, an emotional commitment or an emotional connection. And every game I played has some emotion or even some feel to it. When we talk about the way a game feels when you play it, I feel that a lot of that is captured in the game somehow, and a lot of it actually comes from me as my own emotional response to the game. So as a designer, is that something that you strive for, to try to put an emotion in there, or does the subject matter that you put into it naturally give off an emotion, or is it just all luck?
I'll just start really quickly that, for some of my games that I made a couple of years ago, it was definitely about an emotion I was feeling, or some sort of feeling I had about the world that I wanted to sort of somehow share with other people. Like with Passage, it was this sort of sense of existential terror, my appreciation of the incredible beauty of life, right? And I really couldn't put that into words besides the 4 words that I just used. But those words don't really capture it, and I felt like what I was making with Passage sort of captured that somehow and could share it with people. So yeah, I guess I was sort of trying to, I think that can be done. I mean, I think that can be one goal that you have when you're designing a game, sort of create something that has a feel to it and sort of communicates about something that you can't communicate about in any other way.
Yeah, I must say that we don't do that. We don't really start from a particular emotion. But while we're designing, we sort of jokingly often say that we make the game first and then we design it, meaning in a way that we sort of create the environment, the characters that we're interested in, and then you start looking at how it works and make decisions about what feels right for us. So it's a laboratory both for the player in the end, but for us too, to a large extent as designers.
But don't the spaces that you design still have seems like they have a very thought out feel and atmosphere to them.
Yeah, but we don't start there.
You don't start there.
I think we start with a question, like
right.
What does it mean to have a box with all these little objects in it? So we make that box and we make the objects, and then we start sort of thinking.
Right. So even with Vanitas, the idea of Vanitas came later?
No.
Not so much.
No. Okay. We knew we wanted to make this thing called Vanitas. I mean, we kind of had kicked around this idea for a really long time. But then it was sort of like, comes time to actually make it, and you're sitting there with your preconceived notion of what you wanted to make and the actual reality of making something. And it's kind of as Brenda described, you're sitting there and we don't have like the paint to of our hands in or anything, but you're still sitting there with like all these like, so what is in the box? How does this work? So you make it. You just make it, and then you imagine what that is. I don't know. It's really hard to describe. I mean, so you make it, and then you make it again in a sense when you are finishing it. But it's, you prototype and you iterate and you iterate and you iterate like crazy, and you test it. And, yeah.
I think for me it's sort of many mountains, many paths, right?
Yeah,
So there's many ways to start with a game. You can have an idea, a narrative idea. You can have an idea for an audience. You can have a mechanic idea. You can have a emotional idea. I don't think there's any right or wrong for that. Then there's a kind of iteration that happens during the process. I mean, Jason, you called emergence the catnip of game design, which I love. So, and I think what's great as a game designer is that you get, you sort of suffer on that catnip during the design process as things emerge and iterate, and you seize on accidents and incorporate them into your design, and you heartbreakingly let go of things that you thought that this thing was about as it grows and emerges over time. But then that process happens again as players play your game, either during playtesting or after it's finished, quote unquote finished. And you get to see, like, you get to experience that catnip over and over. And I would say the sweetest pleasure of a game designer, for this game designer, is seeing my players do things that I never anticipated. Having either reactions, whether that's on an emotional, interpretive level, on a social level, on a strategic level, or on a more disruptive level. I think that it's, and even Nathalie and I were just kind of spinning last night, seeing players do things with 16 tons that we hadn't anticipated.
You were on cloud nine.
Yeah, but I think that emergence happens twice. It happens during the design process, and then it also happens for players. And I think that it's a bigger topic, but I think that playing a game deeply does bear a closer relationship to the act of creating a game than, say, a film buff who deeply loves film is to the filmmaker. But that's a whole different kind of discussion.
Well, we should end there. Thank you all very much.